What is up, everybody? Welcome to episode 1 of our brand new podcast where we're talking college football, college basketball, craziness in the sports world, and everything in between. This is going to be a planned weekly Sunday show where we may go live, we may do it pre-recorded, whatever you guys want in the long run. But for at least the next few weeks, as we get into this, everything, we're going to be posting this at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Sundays. Now, today we have an awesome show set up for you. We're talking the major news that broke this week of Texas and Oklahoma possibly joining the SEC, the ramifications of the Big 12 that may happen out of this. Mike Leach wants a 64-team playoff. NIL talk. I know it's about a month old, but Nick Saban did something really smart this week that I really want to talk about. And at the end of the show, we have an interview with former University of Pennsylvania athlete Anthony Lotti. Now let's get into this thing. Guys, we got a brand new face on the channel, or not so brand new. Andrew did a few things for the channel last year in the background, but now it's finally time to bring him onto the channel. Andrew, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Johnny. Thank you for having me. It's an incredible opportunity that you're giving me, and I'm glad that I'm able to be here and help you throughout this journey.
So Andrew helped me with the college basketball video we did earlier this year, projecting the Final Four. We spent so many hours together figuring out the best situation with that. I thought he was never going to talk to me again after we started the whole thing. And he also helped out with some of the college basketball videos last summer as well. And he is everything college basketball while I am the college football guy. So we're going to be covering both sides and taking issues with the college sports world from both sides. And we have some differing viewpoints on some issues. So it should be a fun podcast to watch. Hopefully you guys love this new series on the channel. Now, Andrew, did you see the news this week?
Yeah, I saw it, and at first I really didn't understand why on earth Oklahoma or Texas would really want to join the SEC. When I first saw it and I first thought about it, I looked at it as, why would you want to go and have to destroy your resume by getting smoked by Alabama every single year? Not to mention that the Big 12 has always been looked at, or at least a lot of times have been looked at, as a better basketball conference than the SEC. Yes, the SEC has Kentucky and normally one or two other really good teams, but you're year in and year out normally going to get better competition from the Big 12 in basketball. But I originally didn't see the purpose until I really started thinking about money and revenue and how it would work out. So it'll definitely be a launching point where it's going to create a lot of ripples throughout the entire college athletics landscape.
Yeah, it is something that I've covered on the channel a handful of times. We're going to be talking a little more about that stuff. And it's something not a lot of people really saw coming, especially this week. Especially when you add in the fact that Texas A&M was not informed of the conversations that have been going on for the past 6+ months, which makes things even more interesting with the vote that might be going on this week. They haven't officially announced at the time of recording that they're leaving the Big 12, but that news is expected to come out sometime on Monday, tomorrow, because we're recording this Sunday afternoon. And it is going to create some craziness. I didn't see how this made sense at first either. But yeah, like you said, business. I mean, Oklahoma has dominated the Big 12 over the past decade, basically. And Texas and Oklahoma are the only two teams that have won a national title while in the Big 12 when it started. So just the fact that this stuff is changing right now is insane that you'd never expect. It should create some insanity over the next few weeks. Like you said, why would you want to join a conference with Bama? Well, from everything I've read, as you could see my dog in the background, this is not just a few $1 million a year additions. This is tens of $1 million in TV revenue we might be talking about. So, Andrew, what does this bring to the basketball side of everything?
So for the SEC specifically, it does add to that conference because, as I said, the only team that year in and year out that has been good is Kentucky. Now, Alabama and Arkansas are definitely on the rise as programs, you know, with new head coaches, Eric Musselman and Nate Oates. There's always a few other decent teams in the SEC, but Texas and Oklahoma will add 2 teams that will be good year in and year out. You always expect them to finish in the top half of the conference, if not top 3, top 4, top 5. For all the other teams that are left to pick up the pieces, it leaves a lot of question marks. There's a lot of different things that can happen, and it's going to improve a lot of different conferences. There's been a lot of chatter about a lot of the remaining teams thinking about going to the Pac-12, and the Pac-12 has had some years where they had some lulls in their basketball. So, you know, they really only have had Oregon as a mainstay. Arizona's had a bunch of really good years, but through the turmoil that they're going through with former coach Sean Miller, they're not looking in the best position right now. But the teams out east, like Oklahoma State and some of the Texas teams and potentially Kansas State, they could potentially help bolster the basketball side for that conference and almost ultimately make them the ultimate winners. The Pac-12, that is, the ultimate conference that wins, not necessarily individual schools and teams, but the conference itself would be the big winner as the Pac-12. Or I guess it would become something similar to the Pac-16 now if they were to rename. But there's a lot of different teams that could go a lot of different places. And then the whole idea that the American can finally combine, and it would create a situation where a conference that has been knocking on the door of Power 5, Power 6 basketball-wise is finally able to break through and really become a power conference.
Yeah, their whole selling point is we are the 6th power conference for both football and basketball. And yes, they have Cincinnati and UCF and a few other good teams, but a lot of the times when you look at the whole landscape of the sport, you're like, eh. But it could also lead to the American adding some of the top other group of 5 teams as well. But for the basketball side too, you mentioned that Pac-12 could be the ones to win out in a lot of these situations if they get all those other teams. The other side of things is if Texas A&M is able to get the block on Texas and Oklahoma joining the conference, they more so don't want Texas in the SEC because they want to be the only Texas team to be SEC team recruiting the state of Texas to be able to get recruits over Texas is what's come out basically. And there's been talks. This almost happened almost 10 years ago, back when this when there were almost super conferences 10 years ago. Texas looked into joining the Pac-12 when Utah and Colorado joined the conference. Now, if they were to get rejected from the SEC and not just Oklahoma and Texas, Oklahoma State and Texas Tech join the Pac-12, what do you think that's an almost even better situation for the Pac-12 basketball-wise? Because it's an enormous jump for them football-wise.
I think it could. Yeah, definitely, because Texas and Oklahoma are still both really good teams basketball. That's what you were referring to, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And Texas is looking to be on the rise. Chris Beard is a great coach, and he's been able to draw in 1 billion different transfers from the new transfer rules and the transfer portal this year. So that's going to be an immediate spark to the Pac-12 basketball wise. Oklahoma State, they're really creating some problems for Oklahoma in the past few years and starting to give them more of a competition for who's the best team in the state. So there's a lot of good things that could happen for the Pac-12 to come from this. The SEC benefits a little bit from it. They benefit from the name and the notoriety of it, but they wouldn't necessarily benefit from the competition side of it. Obviously, football-wise, they definitely do with Oklahoma, but in respect to something that's going to revitalize the conference, that's not necessarily going to be done by just adding those 2 teams. Whereas adding 4 really good teams to the Pac-12 to give some competition to Oregon and UCLA and USC, it's not just going to make the conference better. It also, in theory, will start to draw in some more competition and recruiting because just thinking about how Michigan State and Michigan have recruited against each other for years and years and years, you know, now that Juwan Howard is coming to Michigan, they're getting a bunch of new recruits, and you've seen it kind of roll over to other teams in the Big Ten being able to recruit almost against Michigan and Michigan State. It's not fully there yet, but it's starting to slowly. And if we put 4 really good basketball teams into the Pac-12, some of the teams like Washington State, Washington's had good recruits and just not put it together. Stanford, Cal, Arizona State, Arizona, even with the new coach. A lot of those teams are going to be able to help their recruitment with the addition of 4 new teams, even though those 4 teams are already established good teams that have great recruiting success.
That almost theory of, hey, come here, we'll beat those teams that are already established, and you'll make yourself an even bigger name through going through that.
Yeah.
I think wherever Texas and Oklahoma end up, we're going to see some excitement and some fireworks coming. There are talks that it's bad for the sport as a whole, but it also is going to lead to some very different changes. Now, if Texas and Oklahoma join the SEC, there's, like we've already hinted at this already, and like I've talked about in 2 videos already, there are going to be 8 teams looking for new spots. Although Kansas's phone call with the Big Ten turned out not to be actually set up, you still would expect Kansas to be joining the Big Ten. They're an AAU school. They are a premier basketball school, barring any NCAA issues that come from what's been going on. I don't know the story at the top of my head, but I know in the video Scott Fisher and I are going to be releasing on Kansas tomorrow, we talk a little bit about that. And you'd expect Iowa State to also go to the Big Ten because, again, they are an AAU school, and the Big Ten wants AAU schools in their conference. Iowa State brings more of a football side of everything, but they did win the conference only a few years ago, the conference tournament, not the conference regular season title. So they could, although they have not been good at all in basketball the past 2 seasons, you could see them pull themselves back up. And the Big Ten wants AAU schools. Yes, Nebraska is no longer an AAU school, but when they were being talked about joining the conference and when they got accepted into the conference, they were an AAU school. And like we talked about before we started recording, this could lead to conferences still want to stay with their academic standards, i.e. West Virginia to the ACC or not, because West Virginia, from what everybody thought, the reason they got rejected from the ACC a few years back was because of their academic standards. Or do conferences see the money that could come when you bring in these teams and say, we're going to push the academic standards to the side? Now, if Kansas and Iowa State join the Big Ten, what does that do to the basketball side of everything?
To me personally, I think Kansas alone joining the Big Ten could make the Big Ten the undeniably best basketball conference. Yes, you're always going to get some of the best basketball watching a Duke-UNC matchup from the ACC, and there's some other really, really good teams in the ACC, especially with Florida State being on the constant rise, Jim Boeheim being a staple in Syracuse. But the Big Ten has had some great success recently. Almost every single program has been doing consistently well, and it's a fight every single night. There have been some lulls in Penn State, in Nebraska, and in Northwestern, but not too many teams in the conference is bad. And this will finally give them one of those top-tier teams that are amazing. It's a blue blood. It competes with Duke, UNC, and Kentucky every single time they match up. So that alone, to me, will make the Big Ten arguably, not even arguably, just the best basketball conference in college basketball. Iowa State, as you said, they've had some success, but they've been down. They did just hire a new coach. It'll take a few years for them to rebound, but they will eventually get there. It's kind of like Nebraska. Nebraska has had a few really down years recently, and this next year with the McEwen brothers, they could really start doing some special things. So we'll expect to see Iowa State down in the dust for a little while. But even with that being said, they bring in a very energetic rivalry between them and Iowa, the Hawkeyes. So it's still a bonus. And, from the football side of things, it still does add in stuff. So Iowa State and Kansas are two great additions to the Big Ten.
Now, when you look at the ACC, their commissioner came out and said they want to be a more football-centric marketing conference, although they've been known for basketball for as long. In my video, I talked about how I could see Baylor and Houston being considered for the Baylor and Houston considered of joining the ACC. What are some other? West Virginia, everybody wants to put West Virginia in the ACC. Football-wise and basketball-wise, the top two sports, it adds some extra talent, but they really haven't been as top-notch as they were when they were in the Big East in the early 2000s. But who do you think the Pac-12's got two open spots? Who do you think it's between? Do you think it's between Notre Dame, Baylor, Houston, West Virginia?
Two open spots, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're at 14 teams right now.
Okay. No, they're at 15.
Well, Notre Dame's football independent.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah. From the football side of everything, they have two open spots right now.
It's really hard because I think that the ACC is going to try to nudge Notre Dame really hard to start joining us football, especially because they play a very ACC heavy schedule.
Because they have contracts with them.
Yeah, so I think that they're going to be pushing them the hardest. You've made some really good points in Baylor and Houston, and I think that both of those schools are going to be top-notch in both basketball and football. So it's going to be a great addition no matter which one of those. However, I think the ACC, if they have the option to do it, I truly do believe that they're going to be looking at Cincinnati and Notre Dame, if at all possible. If they could get those two teams, I think that would be what would make them the happiest, especially considering the academic integrity of West Virginia. Still a good school, but at the end of the day, in comparison to a lot of the other options available, if the ACC wants to do its best for keeping their high standards of academics, they won't be the option. So I do think that, they're going to try to probably press a lot harder for Cincinnati and Notre Dame, especially if the American and Big 12 remaining teams start meshing together and creating a fifth power conference with the departure of the Big 12.
There's also been talks of Baylor joining the American if the ACC isn't an option, and joining the Big East for basketball. They join the American as a football-only member and the Big East for basketball. And I don't know what would happen with all the other sports, whether that be American or Big East. The Big East is just a basketball conference, or do they have other sports as well now?
They don't have the big sports, but they do have other sports. So I don't believe they have any lacrosse. I know they have little to no baseball. So they do have some other sports, just not the sports that you'll typically see on television on a regular basis.
So we also, Oklahoma State, people want them to, or Oklahoma State fans want them to join the Big Ten. The issue is they're not in an AAU school. But the other thing I came across, I don't know how true this fact is, but I found out that the Big Ten's never let in a school that doesn't have a wrestling team. And Kansas doesn't have a wrestling team. Oklahoma State has one of the best wrestling teams in the nation. If you're Oklahoma State and you get a bid from the Big Ten, are you going to the Big Ten or are you going to the Pac-12?
If I'm Oklahoma State, I would probably go to the Big Ten. It's hard for me to say personally without any bias, just because at the end of the day, I grew up in Big Ten territory. I'm looking at Oklahoma State for grad school potentially. So if somebody wanted to point the finger at me and say, you're just saying that because you want it, that's fair. But I do think it would make sense because you're right. Oklahoma State has a lot of pieces that fit the Big Ten, just with their all over athletic success. They have, out of all teams in the Big 12 throughout all sports, they have the most national championships since in the past decade. So Oklahoma State would find competition for every single sport that they have in the Big Ten. There's always a few great teams in every single sport. You know, their softball team has been pretty good these past few years, and the Big Ten is always producing good softball teams. I don't know the current state of Oklahoma State's baseball team, but the Big Ten normally has at least a few that are going to Omaha every single year. This year, they didn't have as many. It was just Nebraska, I believe. But they still will always have some pretty good talent. So I think if Oklahoma State looks at everything combined, if they have the opportunity to go to the Big Ten, they will choose to do that. It's just about, do they have that opportunity? Will the Big Ten say, come over here? If they don't, then I do think that probably their best landing spaces will either be in a new combined conference with American teams and whatever's left of the Big 12, or trying to transition over to the Pac-12.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the biggest interesting thing is, do these, you would assume 6 Big 12 teams that get left out of the Big 10 and ACC, do they decide as much as possible, let's try to stay together as much as possible? The Americans got 6 spots right now. I think they're at 11 teams. But I think if, like you mentioned, I think Cincinnati or UCF could be considered for the ACC, or even Memphis. Someone mentioned on my video, I talked about the first realignment video was Memphis. But I don't think they're big enough of a school, big enough of a name for both football and basketball to move over, where Cincinnati got Luke Fickell. They got that football team on the rise. They finished in the top 10 last year with their only loss to Georgia in a bowl game. This also creates some competition for Clemson on the football side. And UCF is probably not going to get voted in because too many of the ACC schools for football recruit Florida, and Florida State and Miami probably don't want another Florida team in the ACC. It makes geographical sense, but it's not probably going to happen. Especially since they added Gus Malzahn as a head coach, who could make that an even bigger name football program.
Even just looking at the American Conference itself, they have 4 teams that are located right around where the Big 12 was, with SMU and Houston both being from Texas, Wichita State from Kansas, and then Tulsa from Oklahoma. So a lot of that fits the leftover teams. The only team that's outside of those states that, you know, would still be in the only team outside of those states in general in the Big 12 is Iowa State. So if Kansas and Iowa State leave for the Big 10 and Oklahoma and Texas leave for the SEC, there's a very real possibility that those leftover teams could try to join the American. Just make that a true Power 5, Power 6 conference. And then maybe a few of the teams like Cincinnati does leave for the ACC, ACC, and correction, West Virginia also is outside of those states. So a lot of it is built up both geographically and competition-wise to work well with the combination of the leftover teams with the American.
And I think the American, if you're an American Conference football fan or any sports fan of the American, or you're an American team, you're like, yes, let this situation go. We have this opportunity. We might jump the Pac-12 in viewpoint of power conferences if you get these leftover Big 12 teams.
Yeah.
It would depend on who the Pac-12 ends up grabbing. I think Texas Tech is probably going to the Pac-12. Western side of the state, closer to Arizona and Arizona State than probably everybody else. But it's just hard to see.
They might be closer to Colorado because there's the whole state of New Mexico to try to jump.
Well, I'm talking about, like, if you're talking about like the Southern Division,
Oh, yeah.
A state over from Arizona and Arizona State compared to having to fly from West Virginia to Oregon or
Yeah.
from uh, any part of the eastern side of Texas to Oregon to play a team.
Yeah.
The interesting side is if those teams do join the Pac-12, does the Pac-12 move to a North-South division or do they go to an East-West division?
That's hard. I do think a lot of things that I've been seeing is kind of instead of having two divisions, if you're going to have 16 teams, you're going to have 4 quadrants. And then
Yeah,
it's
the
just
full
going to
pod
be
thing.
From the description I've seen is it's 4 pods of 4. You play each one of the teams from your pod, and then you play either 1 or 2 teams from the other 3 pods every single season. So that would give you 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 conference games every single year for football, that is. So I think it depends. With a conference like the Pac-12, with how big it truly is, I see them as wanting to do something like that, especially because looking at the basketball side, they already have a funky way of scheduling where they pair up 2 teams together that are the closest geographically located, and they always go on the road together, and they always have teams come in and face them together so that they'll play 2 back-to-back home games, 2 back-to-back road games every single time. So I definitely would see the Pac-12 as trying to be that conference that would try to do something more similar to that, personally.
The pods have been something super controversial depending on who you talk to. Some people love it. Some people just hate it. And I think some of the people put a pod with Ohio State, Penn State, Rutgers, and Maryland.
Yeah.
And I mean, God, that's poor Rutgers and Maryland in that situation.
There's going to be a lot of gerrymandering with these pods, because at the end of the day, the biggest thing that these pods are going to do is it's going to foster rivalries and it's going to help them grow, So speaking of the pods that you were talking about, in the same suggestion, there was a pod in the Big Ten with Wisconsin, Michigan, Michigan State, and Minnesota. Minnesota is already Wisconsin's biggest rival. A lot of people will then point to their second biggest rivals being Iowa or Illinois or Northwestern, partly because of location and partly because of the football competition being in the Western Division. But then if you look basketball side, there's been a lot of competition between Wisconsin and Michigan State being the top dog basketball wise, even though Wisconsin is normally a more quiet team on a national scale, just due to their play style and the way the organization is run. But something like that is going to foster, it allows Michigan State and Michigan to play each other every single year still, and it doesn't damage that integrity. It does, however, separate Ohio State from them. So there would have to be some very fine tuning with these pods, where sometimes they will ignore geographical location in favor of competition and rivalries and just what that could do for the sport.
Yeah, I think on the football side, what will end up happening is you keep the East-West side of everything because you want to keep the Ohio State, Michigan rivalry going, and you've got an Ohio State, Penn State rivalry kind of festering up. You don't want Wisconsin to be away from Iowa because that's I think actually turning into their new Thanksgiving game. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure they moved Minnesota up because I think it was because of how lopsided the rivalry was for so long. Now, I don't know if that's the full reason, but Iowa and Wisconsin are always those 2 teams fighting for that Western spot in the Big Ten West a lot of the times. Yes, you have Northwestern also in there who's competed for that spot. I see football side, especially when you look at the SEC, Alabama, Tennessee, Alabama, Auburn, and all these other rivalries in the SEC that kind of get put together in an East-West setup. Yes, you lose the Alabama Ole Miss in a lot of the setups for the East-West, which Lane Kiffin versus Nick Saban has been extremely entertaining to watch. At least last year when they put up over 100 points combined. It's going to be interesting, and a lot of things are going to be changing in the college football world and college basketball world. And that's why we spent so much time talking about this. Now, Mike Leach, sorry, go ahead.
The last thing I had to say about it was just eventually something like this was going to happen. And especially for the 8 leftover Big 12 teams, it's really unfortunate that it's forced to happen in this way where teams are just leaving. You know, it would be so much more ideal if you could just almost just wipe all of the conferences and just have every conference's deal expire at the same time. Now, that's not how things work, obviously, but it would help a lot to just let us start from a blank slate and try to redo these from scratch. You know, it's really difficult to, you know, there's going to be some good teams that get left out. There's going to be some good teams that get put in a rough situation. You know, there's points where it helps teams like Iowa State get to be closer to their rivals, and then there's going to be situations where it takes teams away from their rivals, you know, like the Oklahoma State rivalry. There's a lot of it that goes into it, and a lot of what we even are talking about is all under the assumption that Oklahoma and Texas are going to pay to get out immediately, or even just sooner than waiting until 2025.
Well, actually, if Texas and Oklahoma and then Iowa State and Kansas all decide to leave, the payout's voided. If 4 teams decide to leave, if 4 teams decide of the 6 teams decide to leave, at least that's what I saw literally before recording. I'll fact check it and let you guys know on social media later after this episode's out if that is fully true. I could be completely wrong, and I apologize for that. Comment below and roast me in the comment section for that. The other thing is playoff implications, and Mike Leach had a great idea at SEC Media Day saying he would like a 64-team playoff. Now, that's never going to happen, but I thought it would be fun to mention and have a good time talking about a 64-team playoff. An almost March Madness-esque type of tournament is what everybody thinks. Like I said, it's never going to happen. What most likely after the 12-team expansion, we'll probably see a 16-team playoff all said and done, and I think that's the most you'll get out of it. What was your instant reaction, Andrew, when you heard Mike Leach? Because you informed me of this. I was somewhere else doing Texas-Oklahoma stuff when this stuff was coming out.
So when I saw it, it just kind of made me a little frustrated because it reminded me of all the main reason why I dislike how college football works. And it's like, I understand that football is such a physical sport and it's really hard on your body and it's difficult to deal with. You can't extend a season too long. You know, you could have 1 game a week and be, you know, gassed and blown out from it. But, you know, to then try to do this, to expand it to 64 teams at that rate, there's going to be a lot of teams that get left out that, you know, feel they should be in it still. There's no matter, unless if you go to a full entirety of college football gets into the playoff, you're always going to have 1 team at least that says we should be in this over them. And at the end of the day, there just isn't enough weeks, unless if they played year round, which isn't feasible from what I've been told on how football wears on your body.
Oh yeah, you need an off season.
Yeah,
as 24/7 Sports talks off season, but football players need at least some weeks off, and these guys are students. Don't forget that.
Because, like, I don't think there's a single fan in America that wouldn't be like, that's a great idea. I want to see more football. There's not a single person that would say that wouldn't say that you know, I want to see it. But the issue is that they already have not enough weeks to truly decide who are the best teams to go and play. And then to have to cut out some of those weeks to add in extra playoff weekends, it's just not a feasible idea. And it just kind of frustrated me to think that would be such a cool thing to have, just to see more teams, because who doesn't want to see more teams have an opportunity? Unless if you are Alabama or Clemson, who want to guarantee that you have to go through 2 teams total to make it, to get a championship, as opposed to having to face, what is it? 8 rounds? Not quite. 64, 32, 16, 8, 4. So 6 rounds, having to play 6 different teams to be able to hold up the gold medal, to hold up the trophy.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I'm super happy the college playoff in general got expanded from 4 teams. I think if you're any team and you go undefeated, you should have a shot at a title. And the fact that Coastal Carolina and Cincinnati were undefeated going into bowl season and San Jose State all went into bowl season undefeated and did not have a shot. I think San Jose State went into it. By the way, Nick Starkel, coolest journey. But the fact that you could go undefeated, you play these schedules that, as we're seeing this week, teams getting scheduled for 2032. Schedules that guys are in like elementary school getting set up, and they'll play these 2032 matchups. And you're telling them, oh, your schedule wasn't difficult. Play a more difficult schedule. Yes, you could talk about conference play. But when you bring in the whole resume comparison, Louisiana beat Iowa State. Iowa State lost the Big 12 championship. Coastal Carolina beat Louisiana, and Coastal Carolina didn't even get voted into the top 10 in the college football rankings. I don't believe so. I think the highest was 12, and they scheduled a BYU matchup with 2-3 days notice. 12 teams gives those options, and I love the idea that it's the 4 highest ranked conference champions that get a bye, and 5 highest ranked conference champions that get a automatic spot into the playoffs. And that's why I'm not eliminating the American from getting these Big 12 teams in an expansion playoff, because 5 conferences get automatic bids. American wants to be considered a power conference. You lose the Big 12, American slips right into that Power 5 conference spot. I think there's always going to be technically 5 conferences we consider to be the upper echelons of conferences. And as a Wisconsin former student, alumni now, crazy fan when it comes to Wisconsin sports, if you ever watch me watch a Wisconsin game, having the Wisconsin Badgers get an opportunity to be in the playoffs is awesome, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's always a few teams that are knocking on the door, and a lot of teams won't necessarily go as crazy as UCF declaring themselves national champions, but there's so many times where there's teams that have legitimate shots that could win games and just didn't put it together during the season, that will get screwed over come the time to pick who goes to the playoffs. Just thinking about the way that it is set up with basketball, where there's 64 teams. I don't remember the exact year. It was right around 2012, 2013, 2014. We had a low-seeded UConn beat a almost just as low-seeded Kentucky. And it's moments like those where, it feels almost like that national championship was more earned. While I say that, teams like Clemson and Alabama don't want to have to go through more teams, it will give those players and those organizations, and even more important, those fan bases, this feeling that we earned this more because we truly faced against a bunch of teams and showed that we are the best. And it also gave those other teams that were knocking on the door to be like, oh, that's what would have happened if we would have made it. There isn't that ambiguity of like, well, we could have won it all, so we're just going to declare ourselves champions, and there's not that, but what if we got in? There will be definitive evidence and proof of, if we got in, we took them to this level and we played them this well, and we either succeeded or we fell short by this much.
I also love the idea that the first round games are going to be played on college campuses. You know how wild those stadiums are going to be for those first round playoff games when you let student sections not have to travel to be a part of things, but get to like just walk down the street from their dorms, walk down the street from their apartments, and get to watch the games, barring which college campus you're on.
Yeah, college sports is normally something else when it comes to the stadiums and their fan bases. You typically don't see nearly as many bandwagons. You'll always find some here and there. You'll always have some people that are fans of players or fans of coaches more than they are fans of a team. But at the end of the day, a student who goes somewhere is going to have an inherent loyalty to that place and is going to want them to win more than anything else. You know, professional teams, they need to fight for their fan bases. Not that, you know, colleges can slack off with it, because when teams do bad, we've seen some situations where there haven't been good fans and there have been some pretty ugly situations. But when they are succeeding and when everything is happening right, there's no atmosphere on the world, minus what maybe some of the foreign soccer leagues can put out there, you know, in comparison to how fans react and how atmospheric and how loyal and true and energetic things are in a college football or basketball stadium.
I'm excited to see what happens down the line. And it's just going to be something fun. I mean, the people against it claim that it's going to hurt the regular season. I do see that argument, but where that argument gets thrown out is when you're playing 1 to 2 FCS schools in a college football season. No one really wants to watch those games. And if you're fighting for an at-large bid, you still have to stack your schedule to be able to get that opportunity to play in the at-large bid. So I don't think that's going to really affect scheduling. If anything, I hope it reduces teams from playing multiple lower teams than they should be. And I just, as a college football content creator, as a college football fan, I've always been college football through and through since I was 3 years old. I'm excited to see what happens next in this system. Now, the last thing before we get into the interview I want to talk about was Nick Saban talking about his quarterback, Bryce Young, already reaching over $1 million in dollars earned off of NIL. And while everybody wanted to talk about the number, not a lot of people talked about how smart Nick Saban was for dropping this line. Because you can't offer the NIL deals before recruits get into the colleges. I believe that was the whole argument against NIL, was being used for recruitment. But if you don't think money is being tossed around in recruitment, you're sleeping under a rock. But if you're a quarterback anywhere, a 5-star quarterback, and you hear Bryce Young, before he's ever stepped on the field to be a starter, has earned over $1 million, your ears perk up. And you want to go play at Alabama to even just be able to taste a small section of that. And Nick Saban is a genius for just slyly dropping that line. What? Did you hear that story? And if you did, what's your opinion on it, Andrew?
I've only heard what you've said to me. To me, there's going to be a lot of people that react in different ways. I don't know how to feel about it yet, because I believe that the idea of being able to profit your own name, image, and likeness is a great thing. It's a great thing for athletes to be able to do. I still think that it opens a lot of weird, unprecedented doors, and it's going to create some awkward situations where they need to decide, okay, does this fall under name, image, likeness, or is this a little bit too close to being paid to play? And there, yeah, in respect to what Saban did, there's nothing inherently wrong with what he did. And it is a really, really good recruiting way to do it, to kind of get around those rules. I almost kind of wonder if the NCAA, after hearing that, is going to implement a rule saying you can't release information on your deals, you have to keep it quiet, you know, in which case that's going to be a double-bladed sword where it's going to help foster under the table money that's almost extra from your NIL deals, while it also wouldn't, you know, give, because that's the thing. That was one of the whole arguments against paid to play too, is that it will give some schools unfair advantages when they have more money to give out and just hand to players for nothing. And to use that tactic as, well, if you come to our school, you'll be making millions of dollars, but, you know, pick any other school in the SEC, you go to Tennessee, you'd be lucky if you get a deal. Yeah, you're a quarterback, but you'd be lucky if you get a deal that's worth anything to look at. And that would ultimately destroy competition in recruiting, and even more so destroy competition in the sport. The only way that you'd really be able to keep things entertaining would be if you were to create one of those super conferences of Clemson, Alabama, Oklahoma, Michigan, Ohio State, Florida, etc. great teams, you know. That would be the only way to really survive. Otherwise, it's like, you know, a few years back, it'd be like watching the NBA regular season. You know, it doesn't matter, because you know it's going to be the Golden State Warriors versus the Cleveland Cavaliers. What's the purpose to any other team even playing the game? Because you know it's going to be them. And if you're going to be able to wave around deals like this, that's going to be a much bigger incentive than almost anything on a college campus is, you know, going to be able to wave around. Oh, we have a beautiful campus. Doesn't matter. I can go make $1 million at Alabama. Oh, we have great academics. So, you know, if football doesn't work out with you, we can set you up for career. Doesn't matter. I don't need a job after my couple $1 million that I earned for 3 years as a quarterback in Alabama. You know, and it's, while name, image, likeness is still a great thing to be able to have for athletes, that's a slippery slope that you're going to be down, and it's going to inherently somehow affect recruiting. And the NCAA is either going to, they're going to have a tough choice in the upcoming years. Are they going to have to step in and do something, or are they going to, or is that worse than letting whatever happens happens?
Where I see the interesting side of everything is everyone talked about how college football and college basketball players were going to benefit the most off of this. Well, they're actually finding the female athletes with the bigger social media followings off of TikTok and Instagram are making more money. And for sports that don't really have pro leagues, I think if you are able to set something up while you have this platform, I think it's a great thing to do. Yes, there's going to be the deals, like you said, and all the downsides of everything. But like I mentioned before, if you think there was no money the past few years, since college football maybe got college football inception occurred, you don't think schools have given players money, or boosters have given players money to come to a school? You've been sleeping under a rock. Great documentary I want to recommend to anybody that hasn't seen it, and I'll toss it in the description below. Paid in Mississippi by SB Nation. The SB Nation did it a while back. Shows when this stuff becomes public, what's actually going down in college football.
Even beyond the illegal just handing a kid money, there have been things and loopholes around it for years and years and years. I'm not going to name any names because it's not worth doing that. But, you know, talking to some people, going to a Final Four, you get a lot of free things. And that's not handing somebody money at the end of the day. But, you know, if I'm on X basketball team for X school and we go to the Final Four and I get handed a PlayStation 5 and I have a PlayStation 5 at home, why don't I just flip that for money? There's nothing that you're not supposed to, but how are they going to stop you? Especially because all you have to do is say, oh, I didn't sell that brand new PlayStation. I sold the PlayStation 5 I already had. So there's always been ways that things like that, there's always been loopholes that people have gone through to get around stuff like this. So You might as well just do the best you can, or the NCAA might as well just do the best they can as an organization to set rules that allow for it to happen in a legal way, but still have it be reasonable and make sense.
I think we're going to need a federal law for that stuff to actually go through, which there is talks. Because, I mean, the way it's set up right now, I think it's only 22 states have deals coming up or have gone through. And coaches have talked about, or people have talked about universities going to their state legislation and being like, hey, can you up this deal to be on par with this, say, state? Which I find wild, especially to bring it back to Texas and Oklahoma possibly leaving the Big 12. You have state legislators, lawmakers, and people trying to find things to keep them in the Big 12 or keep them attached to certain schools. And I think that's wild. Everybody says keeps politics out of sports. Politics and sports go hand in hand and will probably always go hand in hand just because of the passion people have for the sport. I mean, we go to the White House when you win a championship.
Yeah, it's just there's always going to be interconnecting pieces that you don't see behind the scenes. You know, anytime a new stadium wants to get built, you know, somebody has to pay for it somewhere. Somebody needs to decide who pays for it. And there's just so many moving pieces that, you know, it's easy to sit there and be, you're an athlete, you're a team, you go on the field, you play your sport, you get off, you be quiet. It's so easy to think it's that simple when realistically it's not. There's so many different things that go into this that just aren't predictable and that there's no avoiding them, you know, like the money caps that you just mentioned, you know, there's always going to be an advantage somewhere because of whatever law is written. And that's why at some point, if the NCAA wants to have control of this and wants to reign on it, they need to make a set of guidelines that everybody can agree to that, you know, will do the best to level that playing field instead of just giving unlimited advantages to those, making the rich get richer.
I mean, the thing we're probably going to see before the NCAA gets involved is either the federal law or the talks of the top 60 or so college sporting programs leaving the NCAA for football, at least, which has been also talked about as long as the Super Conference era has been talked about. But Andrew, before we get into the interview to close out this episode, is there any last things you want to say?
There's not too much I can say. Once again, it's just kind of unfortunate, you know, if it goes through with Texas and Oklahoma, you're going to leave 8 teams scrambling to figure out what they can do to salvage themselves. There will be some unexpected winners from this situation, like the Pac-12 and the American, potentially, one of them. And there's going to be losers. It's inherently going to happen, you know, like Oklahoma State losing in Bedlam, the great rivalry between them and the Sooners. There's going to be some great winners. There's going to be some great losers. It's unfortunate the way that things are happening, but the problem is there's no good way to make this happen. Eventually, somebody was going to run out of their contract and was going to want to find the best money that they could make, and this is just the way that it's happening.
It's going to be a crazy time period over the next few weeks, and we'll be here to cover it and talk to you guys and share our opinions. We want to hear your opinions on what we've talked about. Make sure to leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. Let us know what you want us to talk about, and let us know if you want us to turn this into a live show over the next few weeks. Now, I'd like to throw it to my past self, because I recorded this interview a few weeks ago, Johnny, to interview University of Pennsylvania athlete Anthony Lotti in the first episode of our athletic interview series. I'd now like to welcome my old high school teammate and friend Anthony Lotti into this interview, our season premiere of this series. I am so excited to get into this. Anthony, how are you doing?
You know, I'm doing great, man. It's been a while, so anytime I can link up with the a guy I shared the glory days with back in high school, you know, it's always a good time, man. So I'm excited for this. This is awesome. Thank you for having me.
This is a fun one for me. Anthony and I played Pop Warner football and high school football together. Lotti, you started your football career at the age of 7, is what you told our high school newspaper back in the day. And you had 11 different Division I offers coming out of high school. One of the things I want to get out of this series is talking about different experiences we all go through different sports and how we could share that to the up and coming athletes, especially going into this coming out of this wild time we've been in the past year and a half. What was your recruitment process like? Can you walk us through that at all?
Yeah, so my recruitment process was definitely kind of a whirlwind because, when I was coming up through Pop Warner, I had high school coaches attending my games and, trying to get me to go to their, respective high schools, in terms of, coming out of Pop Warner, I had a pretty good Pop Warner career. We had a very successful team, as you remember. And it was very frustrating in the beginning because, I was able to start varsity as a freshman and I was the first one to do that in Freehold Township history. So I felt like I had a pretty good upper hand with trying to get recruited. And I noticed a lot of guys who were getting offers and they were getting these big time offers and they were being ranked on like 247 Sports and Rivals.com. And it was extremely frustrating for me because I didn't know, how I could get to that level. I knew I had the ability to do that. I knew I had the work ethic, but, I wasn't getting the recognition I quite frankly felt that I deserved. And, there was a point where, I was not contemplating giving up on playing college football, but I was at a crossroads because I was like, when am I going to get an offer? I see these guys getting offers and I'm not getting them and I feel like I deserve them. So what do I have to do? And eventually, sorry about that, but I was able to, get invited to the Nike Spark Combine, it's a regional combine put on by Nike for, the top 500 players in the region. So I was invited to the Mid-Atlantic one where it was guys from, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Delaware, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, etc. And I eventually go there and my combine numbers were, very good with, who I was going against. I was able to run, a 4.48 40, 43-inch vertical. I had 11.1 broad jump and I ran a 4.12 short shuttle. And that was number 1 overall in my position in the country. So I was number 1 amongst DBs and I was top 10 in the country for my score. And that's when I kind of noticed that I was kind of getting the recognition and I was kind of getting the respect that I felt like I quite earned, honestly. And that's when I started having more coaches from, Big Ten schools, ACC schools start to visit me at school. And then eventually, I went to Temple and I was able to have a very good camp there, and I eventually got my first offer from Temple. And after that, the floodgates kind of opened from there. So I got Temple and then right after the next day I got Colgate and then I got Delaware. And then next thing you know, the Ivy League started, knocking on the door because of, my grades, my SAT scores, they all kind of matched up with Ivy League standards. And at that point I kind of knew, the chances of making it to the NFL are extremely slim. You have a less than 1% chance of making it. And especially making a career out of it where, you can make your money and, not have to get a second career. That's extremely rare. So I knew I had this golden opportunity to get into a school like Penn that I would normally never have. And, I had offers from Penn, Yale, Cornell, I want to say Dartmouth as well. And eventually, I settled on going to Penn and, looking back on it, 4 years later, actually recently graduating, thank God I made that decision because it opened up so many doors for me that, normally I would never have if it weren't for football. And something that my dad always, kind of emphasized to me was that use football, don't let football use you. And that's what I did. And I was able to go to Penn. I was able to graduate with a degree from Penn and, the rest is history from there.
Yeah, I definitely think remembering back, your dad being one of our Pop Warner coaches is always funny to look back on and kind of laugh about. That's great advice for up and coming athletes, using football to help you get to places you may or may not have gotten to without the sport. I kind of get, I agree with the whole feeling of how the football recruitment process can just be a whirlwind. How many camps did you end up going to? Do you remember at all?
Yeah, I went to quite a few. First and foremost was the Nike Spark Combine. I went to Temple as well because they invited me and they said I was one of their quote unquote premier prospects that they were very heavily considering giving a scholarship offer to. I went to Rutgers as well. I think those are the only 3 I went to my junior year going into my senior year, because when you go to those bigger FBS schools, the FCS schools, D2, D3, they all follow. So when you go to Temple or you go to Rutgers, Delaware is going to be there. Monmouth is going to be there. Penn is going to be there. Harvard's going to be there. So I was able to kind of showcase my skills in front of, dozens and dozens of different schools. And, I didn't have to specifically go to a specific school that I wanted because I was very strategic with how I went about my camps. Because, as you know, and as anybody else who knows who's trying to get recruited in football, these camps take a lot out of you physically. You have to go there at 8 a.m. You got to run your 40. You got to do your vertical jump. You got to do your broad jump. You got to do all the combine tests. Then you have to go do one-on-ones. Then you got to go do drills. And it's very, exhausting. So I had to be very strategic with how I went because I didn't want to go to, camps back-to-back days and run a 4.4 one day and then run a 4.7 the next day just because my legs were sore. So I ended up going to Nike, and then I went to Temple, and then I went to Rutgers. And then from there, I was able to accumulate the 11 offers that I had.
How are you, choosing UPenn over a Division I FBS school like Temple, that's not a lot of choices. A lot of high school kids would probably do, thinking, oh, I could go this Division I FBS school over this FCS school. What got you to think the long-term we'll get into how your career ended up going at UPenn. How are you, right. What type of advice, because we're going to get probably someone in the comment section saying, how did you turn down an FBS school offer? Who helped guide you to make that lifelong decision over that 4-year decision?
Don't get me wrong, man. It was very tough because, I took a lot of, visits to FBS schools. And, when you see these facilities and they, these boosters are pumping in millions and millions of dollars to these facilities. And, you see these big, sexy stadiums, and you see these locker rooms, and you see these, these weight rooms. And, when you're a young 16-year-old and, you have this very dogmatic approach to football, thinking, oh, I have to go play at the biggest school possible. That's the only way I'll be successful. And that's not the case. And, it was really my dad who kind of, swayed me to the way of thinking, of going to the Ivy League. He said to me, and excuse my language here, he said, "Ant, you'd be a real fucking idiot if you didn't go to Penn, because it's just an opportunity that I would never normally have." In order to get into, any Ivy League school, whether it's Penn, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Cornell, Columbia, you name it, your academic standards have to be top notch. And, thank God I had football because it gave me that extra boost to get into a school like that. And, a quote that always stood out to me, being a Notre Dame fan from, the legendary Lou Holtz was, college is a 40-year decision, not a 4-year decision. And, that weighed heavily in my mind, is that I had these opportunities to go to these prestigious universities, and I would be, very naive to pass those up because it's very rare you have that opportunity. And, being able to go to Penn and meeting the people that I have and the connections you're able to leverage at schools like this, thank God I made that decision when I was 16 years old, because I don't know where I'd be if it weren't for Penn.
So you get to Penn. What's it like going from high school training camp into a Division I training camp, summer workouts? What's that like? And what was the adjustment period like?
I would say that was definitely one of the harder times of my life, was being able to transition from, being the star in high school and, being, kind of the big fish in the little sea, when you're in Pop Warner and you're a star and you go to high school and you're all state and, you think you're going to have that same success just translate to the next level. And that's not the case at all. Because when you get to that level, when you get to Division I football, every single guy there was you growing up. They were all the stars in high school. They were all the stars in Pop Warner football. And now you're kind of on this even playing field. So for me, I kind of thought going into Penn, like, oh, I had these FBS offers, so I'm definitely going to be able to play as a freshman when I get to Penn. And I was hit with a rude awakening. I saw, some top-notch athletes at Penn, guys who were, they looked the part, they played the part. They were all studs. And, you see that right away. And, the adjustment period for me was, when you get to Penn and, you're the 4th string safety as a freshman and you're not playing and you're standing on the sidelines and it fucking sucks, you kind of have to make a decision. Am I going to lie over, cry about it and quit? Or am I going to, apply myself and work harder? And that's exactly what I did. The day the season ended, I asked to have a meeting with our D coordinator and I said, look, I'm not here to complain. I'm not here to, bitch and cry about me not playing. I just want to know, how can I be better? How can I improve? What do I have to do to play? And I will do it. Just give me what you need me to work on. And he was very forthcoming. He said, listen, you're very talented. You're probably the most athletic guy on this team. You need to work on this. You need to work on this. You need to work on this. And I applied those things. And then eventually come time for spring ball, my freshman year, I went from being the 4th string safety to being the starting safety. So I was able to jump the juniors and seniors ahead of me. And then eventually got me to that starting role, going into my sophomore year.
Yeah. And so I think that's great advice and a great message to send of there's going to be a tough road going forward, whether you go to the D1 level, the D3 level, NAIA. And that's why one of the main reasons I wanted to do this series was to cover all 4 levels of sports. It's why we're going to have different athletes of different sports throughout this series. So unfortunately, from my research, you end up injuring your shoulder during spring practice and you end up missing the season. What was that like, having to deal with something like that after putting in all that work, earning the starting role, like you mentioned, and now all of a sudden you're back to almost square one again?
Yeah, so that was definitely a challenge for me because growing up, I never really got injured. I mean, you remember, I didn't really miss any games. So an injury to me, obviously playing football, if a sport as dangerous as that, you're going to be faced with injuries at some point or another. That's why they said the NFL, NFL stands for not for long because, everyone's getting hurt. So that's something I never really had to deal with. And I would definitely say, going back in the summer of 2018, training with Ryan Clark at RC Performance Training. I was training with him every single day. I was dieting hard. I was really trying to focus and hone in on my craft and really trying to be technically sound as a defensive back and, improve my ball skills, improve my footwork, improve my hips, improve my, mobility and my quick twitch muscles. And I really felt like I did that. But I had this nagging shoulder injury that went back to, my spring ball freshman year. I tore my labrum. And that's not really, for everybody who plays football, that's not really an uncommon injury to get is when you tear your labrum. It's very common. But for me, being defensive back, when I was constantly, having to play press man and constantly having to put my shoulders out and hold on to guys and engage in blocks, my shoulder would just tear more and more and more. And it got to a point where if I played press coverage on a 165-pound receiver, my shoulder was going to pop out. This shoulder popped out of its socket. Over 50 times. The pain that you feel when your shoulder pops out of its socket is just hanging there, and then you have to pull your arm back and put it back in. It was brutal. So I cared about football so much. I still do. I loved football so much to the point where I was going to play through anything. I had this opportunity to start at a Division I school as a sophomore. I worked my ass off, and I got to that point where I said, okay, I'm putting all this aside. I'm going to put mind over matter, and I'm just going to keep playing. And it got to a point where, I ended up making a tackle on our starting running back in a game scrimmage in fall camp my sophomore year. And then from there, my labrum completely tore through. I tore my rotator cuff completely through. I did grade 3 separation of my AC joint. And how your shoulder's like a ball and socket, joint like this. The ball, like my humerus bone, actually punched through the socket and was just sitting in it. And when that happened, it clipped a nerve in my neck and I got nerve damage. So all of these things just happened, in one hit. And, I was laying on the ground, like screaming in pain. And the trainers had to take me on the sideline. And they actually had to, since I couldn't lift my arm, they had to cut with a scissor and a knife through my jersey and cut my shoulder pads off and just take my pads off. So at that point, I knew, okay, whatever I have is pretty serious. And this looks like it's going to be a long-term thing. And then eventually, I get my surgery and they say it's an 8 to 9 month recovery for what I had. And I eventually started going through the rehab process. And that was really tough mentally. Anybody who's been injured, they can tell you that the hardest part about being injured is not the physical. It's, the physical issue. It's mental. Because when you're not physically healthy, you're not mentally healthy either. So I was really struggling, having to watch football from the sideline and being a huge bulky sling and having to do all these rehab exercises and see kind of all my hard work just kind of diminish. And that really sucked. It took a toll on me mentally. And that's when, I started to taking care of my mental health and, seeking counseling and all those things. And, eventually it got to a point where I come back to spring ball my sophomore year and I'm wearing, one of those red jerseys that say, you can't touch this guy. He's not doing any contact. So when I went back, I started running. And as I was running, I noticed my whole left arm would just go numb. And then I couldn't feel the tips of my fingers. So at first I was thinking, all right, maybe this is just working out the kinks from the shoulder surgery. I'm just going to get the movement back. And then I noticed, from practice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then by practice 6, I stopped because I noticed this is just getting worse. And then, I meet up with our doctor and he says, yeah, you have thoracic outlet syndrome. Like I can't clear you to play. And that was a really hard thing for me to deal with because, in my mind, I had this whole vision of myself winning an Ivy League championship and balling out at Penn and maybe having a shot of going to the NFL and getting drafted. I had all these things set out for myself and it was just gone like that. And that was a really hard thing for me to deal with. I fell into, a dark place in life. I was very, sad. I was angry, but eventually, life goes on. You had to keep moving on. And eventually, I was able to stick around the football team in a coaching role, but that's kind of how the chips fell at Penn.
Yeah. Making that decision at 20 years old to hang it up and having to deal with that while at an Ivy League school, dealing with an Ivy League education had to be one of the toughest things. But now we get into one of my favorite parts of your story. So I want to make sure I say everything right. Every year Penn enrolls you guys into Be a Match, which is the world's largest bone marrow registry. They've been doing this for 12 years. And you mentioned in an Asbury Park article that there's this 1% chance that you end up being a match. And as you're preparing for finals, your sophomore year, sophomore or junior year, you get a phone call that that 1% was a match for you, and you don't even hesitate to say yes. You do it immediately. What was that like now that you didn't have football now that you were in a coaching role at Penn, you're through finals, you're now dealing with this crazy, this crazy event of being a bone marrow, being a donor. Can you talk us through what that was like and how it was for you?
Yeah, I mean, that was really just a crazy day because I can still remember back. I was in the library. I was in this little cubicle by myself. I was typing a philosophy paper for finals. And then eventually, we did the Be the Match, but when I enrolled, we did it back in, I want to say January of 2018. So I get the call in April of 2019. So almost 14 or 15 months later. I completely forgot I was even in the registry. It never crossed my mind because you give a little cotton swab, you put it in a little baggie, and it's kind of just it's off its way and it's gone forever. Because again, more than 99% of the people are not getting that call. So statistically speaking, I just thought, okay, I'm done. This is probably never going to happen for me. And it happened when I was, really in that dark pitfall, of my life when I didn't have football because I was still dealing with that. And it was only a month after, I made the decision that I wasn't going to play anymore. And I get the call. And I saw it was a Minnesota number because that's where the Be the Match, headquarters is. So I was like, Minnesota. I was like, is this a telemarketer? I was like, who is calling me from Minnesota? And then I answer. And somebody from Be the Match saying, hi, Anthony, do you have a minute? And I said, yeah, what's going on? And they said, well, we just want to inform you that you are in fact a match for a 37-year-old mother with leukemia. We just want to know, are you willing to undergo further blood testing to ensure that you are in fact the match? And at that point, it wasn't even a decision for me. I thought, yes, I'll absolutely do this because, it kind of felt like divine intervention because, while I was going through this, horrible time in my life, I had this other thing just kind of pop out of nowhere. And it kind of gave me that reassurance because I was kind of going through an identity crisis at that time because every time somebody saw me, it was always like, oh, how's football going? Oh, how's football going? When can we come see you play? But at this point, when this happens, it kind of showed me okay, I'm much more than a football player. My purpose in life is far bigger than just playing on a football field. It's bigger than just a ball. And I got that call and immediately just my optimism, my outlook on life just went through the roof. And I was just so happy to be a part of something like this. And it was such an easy decision to make because, God forbid, knock on wood, if I were in that position, if somebody I loved were in that position, if that were my mother or somebody else that I loved, I would want somebody to do that for me. And I would want somebody to do that for my family. So the fact that I was able to, kind of go through that and kind of undergo that procedure to, save the life of somebody else, it's something that I'll just truly never forget.
So then things get even crazier and you get invited to Super Bowl 54 by Roger Goodell.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through that day? Like how it just all went down?
Yeah. So what happened was, apparently, so from what I was told, was that Roger Goodell read the article from the Asbury Park Press because he's kind of like from the area. So I guess he was still subscribed to the newspaper online, and he heard about it. And then he reached out to my coach, Ray Priori, and said, hey, like, I want to invite this kid to the Super Bowl and I want to interview him. Is there any way you can make this happen? And my coach thought, yeah, absolutely. So my coach didn't tell me about this. He did not tell me at all that this was happening. All he told me was that, hey, like, Be the Match wants to do an interview on you. They just want to talk about your experience. He really downplayed the entire thing. So good for him for like not giving it away at all. So he's like, hey, they just want to interview you, you know, kind of just talk about your experience and like what we do here at Penn, you know, just show up in a Penn football polo at 11 in the coach's office and, you know, they'll do the interview there. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. And this is kind of like what we're doing right now. Like I talked about it so much prior while it was happening to the point I thought I was like, okay, this is just another interview I'm going to do. And then I sit down and it's on like a Skype call and I'm looking in like the background and Goodell's not sitting there yet, but I see like an NFL emblem in the back and that kind of caught my eye, but I didn't really think anything of it because it said like NFL headquarters back there. And I didn't really put two and two together. I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like, is this guy like a big football fan? I don't know. And then next thing you know, my coach is like, okay, interview's about to start. Here he comes. Sits down. It's Roger Goodell. And immediately my mind was blown because I was like, why are you talking to me? I was like, what did I do? I was like, how are you talking to me? And he's like, hey man, I'm Roger Goodell. How are you? I was like, oh, I know who you are. I was like, of course I know who you are. And we were just going back and forth for a little bit. The video only really shows like 2 minutes of the conversation we had, but we talked for like 20 minutes. I mean, he was an awesome guy. I mean, he was a very nice guy to talk to. He was asking about Penn and, you know, he's a Columbia alum. So we were just talking some Ivy League football. And then eventually, you know, he points at the bone marrow donation, said, hey, what you did was really awesome. And eventually he presented me a football and said, hey man, listen, you're a leader in this community and we need more guys like you. And, you know, I want to invite you and your buddy to the Super Bowl. And, you know, that was unbelievable because never in a million years did I think I'd get free tickets to the Super Bowl. And we go, it was in Miami. It was Kansas City versus San Francisco. And we're sitting kind of like the nosebleeds, but I didn't care at all. I was just ecstatic to be there. And then eventually, you know, one of his, you know, personnel people or one of his, you know, employees comes up to my seat and they're like, oh, Mr. Lotti, do you have a minute? And I was like, yeah, what's up? What's going on? And they're like, Mr. Goodell would like you to come to a suite right now if you want to go. Like, do you want to go? And I was like, hell yeah, I want to go. That sounds awesome. So we take the elevator down to like the like the suite area of like that level of like Hard Rock Stadium. And I walk out of the elevator. Like as I'm walking out of the elevator, Julian Edelman is walking in the elevator, and I didn't know what to do. Like I panicked, so I just gave him like a head nod. I was like, oh, what's up, Julian? And he just gave me like one of these. And like while he did this, he had like his 3 Super Bowl rings here, and I was like, oh my god. I was like, I do not belong in this vicinity at all. And then so we're waiting outside for a little bit. We're in like the concourse area where they're having like buffet. And my brother pointed out to me that Lady Gaga was like 5 feet away from me. And I was like, okay, this is a lot for me. I'm going to have like a panic attack. Like I don't belong around these people. So eventually we go in to the commissioner's suite. And when I go in there, I see Goodell, I see Jeff Bezos, I see Lizzo, I see Keegan-Michael Key, I see Miles Teller, I see Rob Manfred, I see Chris Berman, I see Tony Dungy. And I'm like, what the fuck? I was like, what did I walk into? I was like, holy Jesus. And I'm just standing there so awkwardly, like I'm sweating because I don't know what to do. And then the woman who like walked us in, she said, like, oh, what are you doing? She was like, go around and talk to people. Like, just go around and mingle. I was like, I can't just go up and talk to these people. I was like, do you know who these people are? I was like, I can't go up and talk to them. And they're like, she was like, okay, who do you want to meet? I'll introduce you. And I was like, can I talk to Bezos? I was like, that sounds kind of cool. And she was like, that's actually the one person I can't let you talk to. And I was like, listen, that's fair. I don't want him to like mail me coronavirus or anything. So I'm just going to stay out of that. And next thing you know, I was like, oh, can I talk to Chris Berman? And I talked to Chris Berman. He shakes my hand. He's like, hey man, like I heard about what you did. It's awesome for you to be here. And I was beaming with happiness. So I talked to Berman. I talked to Rob Manfred. I talked to Goodell. I talked to, you know, Miles Teller, Keegan-Michael Key. Lizzo was a little hammered, so I didn't really get the chance to talk to her. But I mean, again, that's experience that like I truly will never forget, and I'm like so eternally grateful for that I was able to experience that, especially with my brother and one of my friends from school who also did a bone marrow transplant. So like being able to experience that with those guys, where we were, I mean, it really just was unbelievable. Like it's something I'll really never forget.
So after all that, you mentioned this earlier in the interview, you end up becoming a student manager / kind of a coach. What was the difference between coaching and being a player?
I would say being a player, it's way more, obviously there's like a physical element to it. You can better your body, and you can better, your footwork, and better, your technique, and you can watch more film. Whereas, my role with the team, it was kind of more, being that I was in the system for a few years and I understood the playbook and I understood what the coaches wanted to see and, what they wanted to see from the safeties. My role was kind of just, educating those young guys, getting those young guys up to speed. And, like talking to the freshmen, being like, hey, when you see this, make sure, you're filling the B gap on this and not the C gap. Make sure you get down there fast. Or like, oh, if you're playing that cover 3, make sure you disguise it by staying on the hash and then get back and, kind of stare at the quarterback's eyes. So kind of just passing on the knowledge that I have of just the things I've seen playing college football to these guys who were in my position 2 years prior. They're all scared little puppies and they're the little fish in the big sea. So I kind of wanted to be that confidant for them, being like, listen, anything you need to talk about, come talk to me. Like, I'm always here for you guys. Any questions you have, there's no such thing as a stupid question. I've asked every stupid question in the book in DB meetings. So anything you want to ask, anything like if you need a little like expertise on something, just come to me. And that was just kind of my role. And I embraced it. It was one of those things where, being a coach is way more methodical, I'd say. You have to really dissect every little nitty gritty thing that a guy's doing. Because if a guy's footwork is wrong or if his alignment's off, then he's not going to fulfill the play. Then he's not going to make a play on the ball if he's even a yard right up to the left and he's supposed to be a little bit more to the right. So it's kind of just, you look at the game in a different way when you're in that more of that coaching role.
So you recently graduated from UPenn. Congratulations.
Any
future plans at all? Any social media you want to plug at all either also?
Yeah, so I mean, as of right now, I will be, working for UBS in a financial analyst role for 1 minute, and I start that in a couple of weeks. And also, starting a cannabis company as of right now called Earth and Ivy. So if anybody who's watching this wants to follow, it's at Earth and Ivy. It's at Earth and Ivy Co. So you can look for some more updates there of the things that are yet to come from our new emerging company.
Dude, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Anthony Lotti, for coming on and being our season premiere of these interview series. It's going to be going on for the next 10, 15 weeks on the channel. Lotti, thank you.
Hey, man. Thank you, man. It's always nice to talk to you, man. So I'm excited to see the other videos that you have coming up.